78 pages. That's what it took to prove my own family wrong about my grandmother. The lawyer slid the folder across the table, and my mother's hand was shaking before she even opened the cover. Some part of her already knew it was about to end the version of our family she'd spent 3 years building. My Aunt Carol was on her feet, shouting, "This is ridiculous." She didn't know what she was signing. That was before the attorney had said a single word. He just looked at her, calm as anything. This quiet man named Mr. Holloway, who'd represented my grandmother for almost 20 years. And he said 4 words I will never forget. "She knew everything, Carol." For 3 years, my family called my grandmother senile. Forgetful. Confused. They said it at dinner tables. They said it to doctors. They said it to a judge. She was 81. Sharp as a tack. And she heard every single word. Before I tell you what was actually in that folder, and how she beat them all without saying a thing, hit like, subscribe, and drop your city and local time below. I want to know who's with me. Let me take you back to where this really started. My name is Daniel. I was 26 years old when this all started, living 40 minutes away from my grandmother in a small rental apartment, working as an electrician, mostly minding my own business when it came to family matters. I want to tell you up front that I loved my grandmother more than almost anyone else in my life. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 81 years old, and she lived alone in a 4-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane in Maple Heights, Ohio. A house my grandfather Frank had built with his own hands back in 1968. The same house she'd raised 3 children in. The same house she refused to leave, even after Frank passed away from a heart attack in 2019. That house was worth, according to a county assessment my mother later obtained, about $410,000. I'm telling you that number now because it matters later. Everything in this story eventually comes back to that number, and to the people who decided that an old woman's mind was less important than that number. Eleanor had 3 children. My mother, Diane, was the youngest, and the one who lived closest, about 15 minutes from Birchwood Lane. Then there was my Uncle Gary, the oldest, who lived 2 hours away in Columbus and ran a small auto parts business that had been struggling since 2021. And there was my Aunt Carol, the middle child, who lived 20 minutes from Eleanor and worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office. But Carol had always, for as long as I could remember, acted like she was the one truly in charge of the family. Carol was the kind of person who would tell you she was just trying to help, right before doing something that helped nobody but herself. For most of my childhood, those 3 siblings got along fine. Not close, exactly. But fine. Holidays at Eleanor's house were loud and a little chaotic, but mostly warm. I remember my grandmother in that kitchen. The same yellow kitchen, with the same chipped tile counter she refused to replace. Making her pot roast every single Sunday. Telling stories about my grandfather, sharp as anything, remembering details from 40 years ago that the rest of us had forgotten. I need you to hold on to that image of her, because it's important. Sharp. Funny. Stubborn as a mule, my grandfather used to say. She read 2 newspapers a day. Did the crossword in pen. Managed her own finances down to the penny. She was, by every measure that matters, completely and totally with it. Everything started to shift in the spring of 2023, about 3 years after Frank died. That was when my Aunt Carol started showing up at Eleanor's house more often. Not for visits, exactly. For what Carol called checking in, which usually meant going through drawers, asking pointed questions about bills, and commenting, a little too often, on how Eleanor seemed tired or off. I remember the first time I heard Carol use the word forgetful about my grandmother. It was at a birthday dinner for my cousin, and Carol said it almost casually, the way you'd mention the weather. "Mom's getting really forgetful lately." She left the stove on again. My mother nodded along, distracted, juggling a fork and her phone. I remember thinking, even then, that something about the comment felt off. Eleanor had never once left a stove on in her life that I knew of. But I was 26, busy with my own job, and it wasn't my place to question my aunt's read on her own mother. That's what I told myself, anyway. If you've ever had a family member start saying things about an older relative that didn't quite match the person you knew, drop a comment below and let me know. Because I'm starting to think this happens more often than any of us realize. By the summer of 2023, Carol's comments had become a steady drumbeat. Every family gathering, there was a new story. Eleanor forgot to pay the water bill. Eleanor put her car keys in the refrigerator. Eleanor called Carol 3 times in one night because she couldn't remember if she'd taken her blood pressure medication. Each story on its own sounded small. Forgivable. The kind of thing that happens to anyone. But strung together, repeated constantly, they started to paint a picture. And I noticed that Carol was always the one telling these stories. Never my mother. Never Gary. Always Carol, who happened to be the one spending the most one-on-one time with Eleanor. I didn't think much of it at the time, because I trusted my family. That's the thing about this whole situation that still gets me, looking back. I trusted them. I had no reason not to. Carol was my aunt. She'd taken me to the zoo when I was 7. She'd sent me birthday cards every year of my life with a $10 bill folded inside. The idea that she might be doing something calculated never once crossed my mind. In September of 2023, Carol brought up, for the first time, the idea of Eleanor moving out of the Birchwood Lane house. She framed it as concern. The house is too much for her. The stairs, the yard, all of it. She'd be safer somewhere smaller. My mother seemed to agree, at least partially. Gary, from 2 hours away, mostly stayed quiet on the subject, which I'd later learn was its own kind of complicity. Nobody asked Eleanor what she wanted. Not directly. Not in a real conversation. They talked about her like she was already gone. Like her preferences were a formality to be worked around, rather than the actual point of the discussion. I went to visit my grandmother myself in October of that year, partly because something about the conversations at family gatherings had started to nag at me. I sat in her kitchen, the same yellow kitchen, and she made me coffee and asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. She told me a detailed story about a disagreement she'd had with her neighbor, Mrs. Petrov, over a property line. Complete with dates and exact quotes from the conversation. She did the crossword in front of me, in pen, finishing it before I'd even drunk half my coffee. I left that visit more confused than ever. The woman my family was describing at every gathering simply did not match the woman sitting across from me at that table. So I started paying closer attention. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't confront anyone or make accusations. I just started watching. And listening. And noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The first thing I noticed was that Carol had started managing Eleanor's mail. She told everyone it was just to help sort the bills. But I noticed she'd also started intercepting things addressed directly to Eleanor from her bank, and from a law firm I didn't recognize. The second thing I noticed was that Carol had started attending Eleanor's doctor's appointments, sometimes going in without Eleanor, claiming she needed to speak with the doctor privately about her mother's care. The third thing, and this is the one that really stuck with me, happened at Thanksgiving that year, November of 2023. We were all at Eleanor's house. The house was still hers. Nothing had changed yet, on paper. Carol made a comment at the table, in front of everyone, including Eleanor, that her mother wasn't always able to follow conversations anymore. Eleanor, sitting right there, said, calm as anything, I can hear you, Carol. I'm sitting 3 feet away from you. The table went quiet. Carol laughed it off, said something like, see, that's the spirit, Mom, and changed the subject. But I watched my grandmother's face in that moment, and I want you to understand something. There was nothing confused in that expression. There was hurt. There was anger. There was a woman who understood exactly what was being said about her, and exactly why it was being said. That was the moment I started to believe something was actually wrong. And not wrong with my grandmother's mind. If anyone watching this has ever sat at a table and watched someone talk about a family member like they weren't there, even though they were sitting right next to them, comment below. Because I think a lot of us have lived through some version of that moment. By early 2024, things moved faster. Carol convinced my mother that Eleanor needed a geriatric evaluation, which sounds reasonable on its surface, except that Carol scheduled it with a doctor neither my mother nor I had ever heard of. A Dr. Lansing, whose office was 45 minutes from Eleanor's house, in a different county entirely. I later found out, through a conversation I overheard between Carol and my mother that I wasn't supposed to be part of, that Carol had specifically chosen Dr. Lansing because a friend from her dental office had mentioned he was easy, and didn't take long to write up a diagnosis. I want to pause here and say something clearly, because I think it matters. I am not a doctor. I don't know what was said in that evaluation room, and I'm not going to pretend I have some secret medical insight into my grandmother's cognitive state. What I do know is what happened in our family afterward, and what that paperwork was used for. And I think when you hear the rest of this, you'll understand why I have serious doubts about how that evaluation was conducted. The evaluation happened in February of 2024. Carol drove Eleanor to the appointment alone, which Eleanor later told me she found strange, since Carol had never offered to drive her anywhere before that wasn't already on Carol's way. Eleanor described the appointment to me herself, months later. Her account was that it lasted less than 20 minutes. The doctor asked her to count backward from 100 by sevens. Asked her what year it was. Asked her to name the current president. Asked her to draw a clock face. She told me she'd gotten flustered on the clock drawing, partly because the pen they gave her was nearly out of ink and she'd had to press hard, and partly because Carol kept hovering over her shoulder the entire time, which she said made her nervous. I felt like I was being tested for something I didn't know I was being tested for, she told me. Like a final exam nobody told me about until I was already in the room. The report that came back from Dr. Lansing's office described mild cognitive impairment, consistent with early-stage dementia. Carol had copies made immediately. She brought them to a family dinner in March of 2024 and laid them on the table like she was presenting evidence in a trial. My mother cried. Gary, on a video call from Columbus, said something about how it was for the best that they start looking into options. Nobody, in that entire conversation, asked what Eleanor thought about any of it. Nobody asked her how the appointment had actually gone. Nobody asked if she wanted a second opinion. I asked. I was the only one who asked. And for that, Carol gave me a look across the table that I can only describe as pure irritation. Like I'd disrupted something that was supposed to go smoothly. Has anyone asked Grandma what she thinks about all this? I said. Daniel, sweetheart, this isn't really something she's able to weigh in on clearly anymore, Carol said, in that soft, patient voice people use when they want to sound caring while shutting you down completely. She's sitting right there, I said. Because Eleanor was, in fact, in the next room, well within earshot, having stepped away to get more coffee. That's not the point, Carol said. I want you to notice something about that exchange, because I didn't fully understand it myself until much later. Carol's argument was never really about whether Eleanor was capable of being part of the conversation. It was about making sure she wasn't. Comment below if you've ever watched a family talk about someone's best interests while making absolutely sure that person never got a seat at the table. I think this happens to elderly people far more often than any of us want to admit. After that dinner, things accelerated quickly. And looking back, I think that pace was deliberate. Slow enough that no single step looked alarming on its own. Fast enough that by the time you noticed the pattern, several decisions had already been made. In April of 2024, Carol brought up just-in-case paperwork. A power of attorney, she said. Nothing dramatic. Just something sensible for a woman Eleanor's age to have in place. My mother, eager to smooth things over and avoid more conflict, agreed it sounded reasonable. Gary, over the phone, agreed too. I want to be honest that at the time, even I thought a power of attorney sounded like a normal, responsible thing for an elderly person to have. It's the kind of advice you hear all the time. Get your affairs in order. Don't leave things to chance. What none of us knew, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Carol had already contacted an attorney of her own. A man named Russell Dempsey, who worked alone out of a small office above a strip mall pharmacy. She had specifically been asking him about something called a durable power of attorney. One that would give the holder, meaning Carol, broad authority over Eleanor's finances and property, not just in an emergency, but immediately, and without requiring a court to declare Eleanor incompetent first. Eleanor signed that document in May of 2024. I wasn't there. My mother wasn't there. Only Carol was there, along with Russell Dempsey and his assistant, who served as a witness. When my mother later asked Carol how it went, Carol said Eleanor had been a little confused about some of the wording but understood the gist of it. I think about that phrase a lot. The gist of it. As if a woman's legal and financial future could be reduced to something she only needed to vaguely grasp. I saw Eleanor about 2 weeks after she signed that paperwork. I asked her, carefully, gently, what she remembered about it. She told me, and I remember this almost word for word because it bothered me so much at the time. Carol said it was so she could help me pay bills if I ever ended up in the hospital. I don't see the harm in that, do you? I didn't see the harm in it either, not then. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have the full picture yet, and I made the mistake of thinking that if my own mother had agreed to it, it must be fine. That's something I regret now. The amount of trust one placed in adults who I assumed were acting in good faith simply because they were family. Within a month of signing that power of attorney, Carol opened a joint checking account that combined access to Eleanor's existing savings. An account that, according to records that would later surface, held just over $190,000. Money Eleanor and my grandfather had saved over 40 years of careful living. Of clipping coupons and skipping vacations and patching the same roof 3 times instead of replacing it. Within 2 months, Carol had also started making inquiries with a real estate agent about the Birchwood Lane house. Describing it, in an email that would later become part of the legal record, as a property the family was preparing to list once arrangements were finalized for my mother's care. I want to pause again and just say plainly what I think a lot of you watching this might already be feeling. This is the part of the story where it stops being about love, or worry, or family concern, and starts being about money. $410,000 in property. Close to $200,000 in savings. And an 81-year-old woman who, despite all the paperwork and all the dinner table commentary, was still, in her own home, doing the crossword in pen every single morning. In June of 2024, Carol brought up assisted living for the first time directly to Eleanor. Eleanor told me about that conversation herself, and her voice, when she described it, had an edge to it I'd never heard from her before. She sat me down like I was a child, Eleanor said. She had brochures. Brochures, Daniel. For a place called Maple Crest Senior Living. $2,800 a month, she told me, like that was supposed to make it sound like a good deal. Eleanor told Carol no. Flatly. Clearly. No. She said she had lived in that house for 56 years, that she intended to die in that house, and that she did not appreciate being shown brochures like a problem that needed solving. I think that's the moment Carol realized that getting Eleanor's cooperation wasn't going to work, and that she needed something stronger than persuasion. That's when the conservatorship conversation started. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you to do something for me. Pause for just a second and think about whether you know an elderly relative, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, who might be vulnerable to exactly this kind of slow pressure campaign. I'm not asking you to suspect everyone in your family. I'm asking you to just check in. Comment below with the word checking in if you plan to call someone after watching this. Because I think that small action matters more than people realize. In July of 2024, Carol consulted with Russell Dempsey again, this time about pursuing a formal guardianship, sometimes called a conservatorship depending on the state. This would allow a court to declare Eleanor legally incompetent and transfer full control of her finances, her medical decisions, and potentially her living situation, to whoever the court appointed. Which, conveniently, Carol intended to make sure was her. To pursue that, Carol needed more than one shaky 20-minute evaluation from a doctor in another county. She needed a paper trail. And so, starting in the late summer of 2024, the paper trail began in earnest. Carol started keeping what she called a concern journal. A notebook where she logged every incident, real or invented, that supposedly demonstrated Eleanor's declining mental state. I saw this notebook myself once, by accident, when I stopped by Eleanor's house to fix a leaking faucet and found it left open on the kitchen table. Entries like August 14th, Mom forgot she'd already taken her pills and almost took them twice. Entries like August 22nd. Mom got confused about what day my appointment was. Entries like September 3rd. Mom seemed not to recognize Gary's voice on the phone at first. I asked Eleanor about a few of these entries later, carefully, without telling her I'd seen the notebook. The pill incident, she explained, had happened because Carol herself had moved Eleanor's pill organizer to a different cabinet without telling her, and Eleanor had simply been looking for it in its usual spot. The confusion about Carol's appointment had happened because Carol had texted her the wrong date and then corrected herself an hour later. The Gary phone call, Eleanor said, had happened because their phone connection was bad and she genuinely thought it was a wrong number for the first few seconds. Which, frankly, has happened to me on phone calls too, and I'm 26. Every single entry in that notebook, when you actually examined it, had an innocent explanation. But strung together, dated and timestamped and presented to a judge, they would look like a steady, documented decline. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. It wasn't lying, exactly. It was curating. Taking ordinary human moments and reframing every single one of them as evidence of something they weren't. In October of 2024, Carol filed a petition with the county probate court requesting guardianship over Eleanor. Citing the Dr. Lansing evaluation, the Concern Journal, and statements from what the petition called concerned family members. Which, as far as I could tell, meant Carol, and, reluctantly, my mother, who I believe by this point had been worn down by months of Carol insisting this was the responsible thing to do. I was not asked to provide a statement. I want you to understand why that matters. I was the one family member who had spent real, unsupervised time with Eleanor over the previous year. Who had watched her finish crosswords in pen. Who had heard her recount detailed stories with names and dates intact. Who had heard her clearly and explicitly refuse the idea of assisted living. My account would have complicated the picture Carol was building. So my account was never sought. This is the part of the story where I want to slow down, because everything that happens next happened because of one decision Eleanor made on her own, quietly, months before any of us knew the guardianship petition existed. Back in January of 2024, before the geriatric evaluation, before the power of attorney, before any of it, Eleanor had grown uneasy. Not about her own mind, she told me later. But about Carol's behavior. The mail interception. The unannounced visits to doctors' offices. The comments at family dinners. She told me that something in her gut had started telling her, quietly but persistently, that she needed to protect herself, even though she couldn't yet articulate exactly what she needed protection from. So in February of 2024, the same month as the Lansing evaluation, Eleanor had done something none of us knew about. She had contacted Mr. Holloway, the attorney who had handled my grandfather's estate planning back in 2018. A man she trusted because Frank had trusted him. A man with an office 20 minutes from her house and 30 years of experience in elder law. She had told Mr. Holloway, in their very first meeting, that she suspected her daughter Carol might be trying to take control of her finances and her home, and that she wanted to document, clearly and thoroughly, that she was of sound mind, so that no one could later claim otherwise. What followed, over the next year, was something I genuinely did not know about until the very end of this story. Something I think is one of the most quietly remarkable things I have ever learned about another person, let alone my own grandmother. Mr. Holloway, at Eleanor's request, began a formal, ongoing process of documenting her cognitive capacity. Not once. Not in a rushed 20-minute appointment with a stranger. Repeatedly, methodically, over the course of an entire year. Eleanor met with Mr. Holloway once a month, sometimes more, always alone, always without Carol's knowledge. At each meeting, Mr. Holloway had her complete a written cognitive assessment. The same kind used by neurologists. A series of memory tests, orientation questions, problem-solving exercises, and reasoning tasks. He had her write detailed, dated journal entries in her own hand describing her daily life, her finances, her opinions about decisions being made around her. He had her review and sign off on summaries of every financial transaction in her accounts each month, demonstrating that she understood exactly where her money was going. He brought in an independent neuropsychologist, a woman named Dr. Patel, completely unconnected to anyone in our family, who conducted 2 separate formal evaluations, in March and again in September of 2024. Both concluded that Eleanor's cognitive function was entirely within the normal range for her age, with no evidence of dementia or significant impairment. He had her record, on video, with timestamps, short statements describing recent events in her life, current events in the news, and her own stated wishes regarding her home, her finances, and her family. He kept copies of every receipt, every letter, every email Eleanor showed him that documented Carol's behavior. The brochures for Maple Crest. The joint account paperwork. The real estate agent's email. By January of 2025, when Carol's guardianship petition finally reached a hearing date, Mr. Holloway had compiled all of it. Every test. Every journal entry. Every video. Every financial review. Every piece of correspondence. Into a single bound document. 78 pages. A complete, exhaustive, professionally documented record of 1 full year in the life of a woman who, according to her own daughter, was no longer capable of understanding her own affairs. If you've ever underestimated someone, especially someone older, because of their age or their quiet, soft-spoken manner, I want you to comment below. Because I think this story is about to teach all of us something important about that. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for January 14, 2025, at the county probate court. I want to walk you through that day carefully, because it is the moment everything I've been telling you finally collided. I almost didn't go. I'd heard about the hearing only because my mother mentioned it in passing, clearly assuming I already knew the broad strokes of what was happening and wouldn't object. I asked to come. My mother seemed surprised, but didn't say no. The courtroom wasn't dramatic in the way you see on television. It was a small hearing room. Fluorescent lights. A tired-looking court reporter. A judge named Judge Esperanza Cole, who had clearly sat through 100 cases just like this one. Carol was there with Russell Dempsey. My mother sat beside Carol, looking pale and uncomfortable. Gary had driven up from Columbus for the occasion, sitting stiffly in a suit that looked like it hadn't been worn since a wedding. And Eleanor sat at a small table to the side, with Mr. Holloway beside her. Calm. Composed. Wearing a navy cardigan and the same pearl earrings she'd worn to every holiday dinner I could remember. Russell Dempsey opened by presenting the petition. He cited the Lansing evaluation. He read selected entries from Carol's concern journal aloud. The pill incident. The appointment confusion. The phone call with Gary. Presenting each one without any of the context I'd later learned explained them. He argued that Eleanor's continued independence posed a serious risk to her safety and financial well-being, and that guardianship, with Carol appointed as guardian, was in her mother's best interest. When Carol spoke, she cried. I want to say that plainly, because I think it's important. She cried real tears, and she said, in a trembling voice, I love my mother. Everything I've done has been because I love her and I'm scared for her. And I believe, even now, that some small part of Carol genuinely believed that. I think people are capable of convincing themselves of almost anything when there's enough money involved to make the convincing worthwhile. Then it was Mr. Holloway's turn. He stood up slowly, adjusted his glasses, and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a complete record, prepared over the course of the last 12 months, documenting Mrs. Whitfield's cognitive function, her financial understanding, and her own stated wishes, all gathered independently and without the knowledge of the petitioner. He handed the folder to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. 78 pages. Judge Cole spent almost 20 minutes paging through it in silence while the rest of us sat there. I remember the sound of the clock on the wall. The sound of Carol's foot tapping against the floor. The sound of my own heartbeat, which felt embarrassingly loud in that quiet room. Then Judge Cole looked up and asked Mr. Holloway to summarize the contents for the record. He walked through it methodically. The monthly cognitive assessments, every single one scoring within the normal range, several scoring above average for her age group. The 2 independent neuropsychological evaluations from Dr. Patel, both concluding no evidence of dementia or significant cognitive impairment. The video statements, which the judge then watched portions of right there in the courtroom. Eleanor speaking clearly and specifically about her finances, about current events, about her explicit wish to remain in her home, and her explicit objection to the power of attorney and joint account changes that had been made. And then Mr. Holloway said the part that made my mother's hand start shaking before he'd even finished the sentence. He explained that Eleanor had come to him in February of 2024, before the Lansing evaluation, before the power of attorney, specifically because she suspected her daughter was building a case to take control of her assets, and had asked him to help her create an unimpeachable record proving otherwise. She knew exactly what was happening, Mr. Holloway said, looking directly at Carol. She knew everything, Carol. I watched my aunt's face in that moment, and I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing but vindication, because I didn't. I felt something more complicated than that. I felt the floor of my own family tilting. The realization settling in that the version of events I'd been told for almost 2 years had been, in large part, a performance. And that the only person who had seen through it clearly enough to actually protect herself had been the one person everyone had assumed was too far gone to understand what was happening to her. Judge Cole asked to speak with Eleanor directly. Mr. Holloway nodded, and my grandmother stood up, walked to the small witness area, and was sworn in. I want to tell you what she said, because I think about it often. The judge asked her, simply, Mrs. Whitfield, can you tell me what's been happening over the last year, in your own words? And Eleanor said, my daughter Carol decided sometime last year that I was no longer capable of taking care of myself, and instead of asking me how I was doing, or what I wanted, she started building a case against me. She took me to a doctor I'd never heard of, in a county I don't live in, and that doctor spent less time with me than it takes to get a haircut. She opened an account with my money without sitting down and explaining it to me properly. She showed me brochures for a place that costs more a month than my husband and I used to make in 2 months combined, back when we were young and broke and happy. I am 81 years old. My memory isn't what it was when I was 40, and I won't pretend it is. But I know my own name. I know my own money. I know my own house. And I know my own daughter, which is, frankly, the hardest part of all of this. The courtroom was completely silent after that. Judge Cole denied the guardianship petition. Not narrowly, not with hesitation, but firmly, stating for the record that the evidence presented by the petitioner was, in her words, selectively curated and substantially undermined by extensive, credible, independently verified documentation demonstrating the respondent's clear and consistent cognitive capacity. She further noted, and this part still gives me chills, that the existing power of attorney executed in May of 2024 appeared, based on the totality of evidence, to have been obtained under circumstances that warranted further review. She referred the matter to the court for a separate hearing regarding potential revocation of that document, and a possible investigation into financial exploitation of an elder. A crime that, depending on findings, carried real legal consequences in our state. Carol did not cry again after that. She sat very still, very pale, and didn't say a word as the hearing concluded. If you've ever watched someone's carefully built story fall apart in real time, comment below. Because I don't think there's anything quite like watching the truth catch up to a lie that's been allowed to run for too long. I want to take you through what happened in the months after that hearing, because the legal outcome, while it mattered enormously, wasn't really the end of the story. The end of the story was about what happened inside our family. The power of attorney was formally revoked in February of 2025, and the joint checking account was unwound under the supervision of the court, with every dollar traced and returned to an account in Eleanor's name alone. Mr. Holloway told my mother, in a conversation she later relayed to me, that the district attorney's office had reviewed the financial records and was deciding whether to pursue charges against Carol for elder financial exploitation. Though ultimately, and I think this surprised all of us, Eleanor herself asked them not to pursue criminal charges. She said she didn't want her grandchildren growing up watching their grandmother and their aunt go through a criminal trial, and that the embarrassment of what had already come out in that courtroom was, in her words, punishment enough for now. I don't know if I agree with that decision, honestly, even now. Part of me thinks Carol should have faced more consequences than she did. But it wasn't my decision to make, and I respect that it was Eleanor's choice and Eleanor's alone. My mother came to my apartment about 2 weeks after the hearing, and we sat at my small kitchen table, and she cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before. Not even at my grandfather's funeral. She told me she felt like she'd let her own mother down in the worst possible way. That she'd been so eager to avoid conflict with Carol, so willing to believe the narrative Carol kept building because it was easier than questioning it, that she hadn't actually looked at her own mother clearly in almost 2 years. I looked at the journal entries instead of looking at her, she told me. I let someone else's notes replace my own eyes. I didn't have much comfort to offer her in that moment, honestly. I told her what I believed, which was that she could spend the rest of her life either drowning in that guilt, or using it to actually show up for Eleanor going forward. And that only one of those options was useful to anyone. Gary, for his part, sent Eleanor a long letter, which she showed me later, apologizing for staying quiet for as long as he had. He admitted that part of his silence had come from knowing that if guardianship had gone through, Carol likely would have eventually pushed to sell the house. And that some quiet, shameful part of him had been comfortable with that outcome, because of his struggling business. I respect that he admitted that, even though I think it's one of the more uncomfortable truths in this entire story. Sometimes people stay silent not because they're confused about right and wrong, but because the wrong outcome happens to be convenient for them. Carol, as far as I know, has not spoken to Eleanor since that hearing. Not really. Not in any meaningful way. There was one brief, strained phone call in March of 2025, which Eleanor described to me as Carol insisting she'd only ever wanted to help, and Eleanor responding that help generally doesn't require hiding things from the person you claim to be helping. They haven't spoken since. I visit my grandmother now almost every weekend. She still lives in the house on Birchwood Lane. She still does the crossword in pen every morning. And she started, this year, teaching herself to use a tablet so she can do video calls with an old friend who moved to Arizona. Which I think is a small but meaningful symbol of exactly how far from incapable she actually is. A few months ago, I asked her something I'd been wanting to ask since that day in the courtroom. I asked her how she'd known, that early, back in January of 2024, before any of the paperwork, before any of the doctor's visits, that she needed to start protecting herself. She thought about it for a long moment, stirring her coffee even though there was nothing left to stir, and then she said something I think about constantly now. I didn't know exactly what Carol was planning. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have proof of anything yet. But I knew the feeling of being slowly written out of my own life, a little at a time, in ways small enough that objecting to any single one of them would have made me look unreasonable. And I decided that if no one else was going to take that feeling seriously, I was going to take it seriously myself. even if it meant doing something my own daughter would probably consider paranoid. I think about that a lot. The idea that the people who love you most can sometimes be the ones who erase you the most carefully. Simply because they've convinced themselves it's for your own good. Or because the version of you that's easier to manage happens to also be the version that's more convenient for them. And I think about how my grandmother, at 81 years old, with no legal training, with no one backing her up, with her own children either actively working against her or too distracted to notice, had the foresight and the quiet courage to build her own defense one monthly appointment at a time. Never telling a single person until the moment it mattered most. I'm not telling you this story so that you walk away from it thinking every family is secretly plotting against their elderly relatives. I don't believe that, and I don't think it would be fair to the family members watching this who genuinely, selflessly care for aging parents and grandparents every single day, often at real personal cost. What I am asking you to consider is something simpler. Pay attention to how the people in your life talk about your elderly relatives when those relatives aren't in the room.